Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. When I say the word swastika, what comes to mind? Most likely connotations of evil related to Nazi Germany. But this interpretation can vary by geographical location, time, and culture. German citizens in the late 30s and early 40s saw the same swastika and didn't equate it with evil at all. And for Hindus, the swastika represents good luck and prosperity and is a staple in marriage ceremonies. The fact is, the swastika is over 12,000 years old and has accrued different meanings for different people over time. This volatility and power perfectly encapsulates our topic today, symbolism. So, when we think about symbols, we don't necessarily think about power, but when writing the intro for this episode, I really balked at the idea of using the swastika. And so that very hesitation tells you that symbols do have great power.
They do. And you're right. Most people don't. Well, I won't say most people. That would be overgeneralizing. I think that the first thought is not necessarily that a symbol is powerful because people are just used to symbols. I mean, if you think of something like a cross. Many people have a pendant with a cross on it, and one could automatically assume that that person was a Christian. And I've encountered many students who, you admire the pendant, or you talk, and no, it's just pretty, or it just looked cool, or whatever it is. And so I think that we are, as you used the word in our pre-show talking today, oversaturated or supersaturated with symbols, so much that, like all things, they might diminish in power, unless you're really thinking about why you have that symbol associated with yourself.
Yeah. And so, I think that is something that people, the swastika is a really good example because there was such a wide swing in its meaning. Because up until, Nazi Germany, even in America, the symbol would have been a sign for good luck or prosperity. It's sort of a rabbit's foot kind of thing. And so, all it took was one totalitarian regime to completely change the meaning of it, not for everybody everywhere, but for a large part of the Western world for, probably forever.
Indelibly. And so the power that was forming that chose that symbol as its representation, thereby, forever altered that symbol for most people. So symbols do have the potential of being world changing. Right.
So we've talked about symbols so far like we know what they are. So now we're going to get into a bit of the nitty gritty in defining what a symbol actually is. So what is a symbol?
I almost always go with the secondary definition for most everything. Because for me, the symbol is a tangible representation of the physical, alphabetical, or in some way artistically, visually rendered representation of an abstract concept. And of course, as soon as you get into the abstract, think about the sign for infinity. Just because we have that loop, or the double loop, you can look at that and, somebody assigned it that meaning. But then it resonated. If it hadn't, if it just was a workaday tool, it would have perhaps been known in smaller communities. But somehow it resonated. It touched with something. People grew the power of it, and that's just a relatively benign symbol.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing we'll get into a little bit later when we get to our formative section. So what I had down, without looking at the dictionary, me just trying to come up with a definition off the top of my head, I said a symbol is a deliberate sensory message that conveys information or representation. in the academic world is all of a sudden you're looking at, all right, so symbols, presenting info or representing things, you can kind of split it then. And so the real question philosophically becomes, what is the difference between a sign and a symbol?
Well, if we signs, not as in signs and portents and those kind of things, but sign as in Sarah's grocery store or Eric's bakery or whatever it is, or to think about it, Western, the old West kind of thing, where you'd see a horseshoe, and that meant you were going to a blacksmith's place or an anvil or something. So it's a rather workaday kind of thing. A sign is, here's what you can get at this place, or this is the one thing that this means. A symbol is usually resonant and layered with many meanings or potential meanings or associations or clusters. So a sign would be, I don't want to use, I'm not using the word shallow in a negative sense, but a sign is a sort of surface level. A symbol is the deeper fathoms.
Right. And so there's a whole field that studies this called semiotics. And signs tend to be equated with nature and symbols are more cultural. So your definition is right. It's almost as if signs are, like you said, a singular objective message, whereas symbols are more subjective and layered object that's more prone to interpretation.
And right? Both of them, though, and this is where, semiotics and crosses over both with linguistics and philosophy, and I've been fascinated with it for a lifetime. Both of them are artificial. In the sense that with a sign, when you study semiotics and you come to realize you become alien to the very things that you've taken for granted forever. Like, okay, so FE stands for iron. Why? Well, okay, and you start asking why. You say, well, but what else could I? Or mama, the word, that's a sign indicating the parent. Well, why that word, that sound, that's almost a universal sound, but yet we've assigned, or go back to any of the stories, the Eden type stories across cultures where somebody starts doing the naming. This is this, and therefore horse, elephant. Well, it didn't, linguistically happen quite that way, but it's all artificial.
So now we're getting into the really interesting stuff, and this might be real early in the episode to get into the formative part, but I'm going to, because I think we're going to spend a lot of time on the speculative part on the back end. So we'll jump right into the formative one. So I'm going to ask the first question, which is any type of communication symbolism or symbolic?
Yes. First, because just to back up a moment, because in some levels in some pockets of semiotics or linguistics, a sign and a symbol are pretty much interchangeable. Okay. So in that level, everything is yes to that. So ask me again.
So is any type of communication symbolic or symbolism?
Yes. Because think about what I just said yes. And that sounds sure. But yes to what? Well, I'm answering a question that itself is very laden with abstract possibilities. So just because I say yes doesn't mean that you know what I mean by yes, and we know each other a lot, and so you probably do, but we make that assumption. I mean, any word rife with interpretation. We many times in class talking about this, right? So take a word like war, or hate, or love. Well, we all know what that means. But do we know it means the same thing? When I use the word love and you use the word love, do we know what you're saying? How do we know we're doing the same thing? It's very epistemological. I might not be thinking about the same thing that you are. Even tree. Say the word tree. This takes us back to ancient philosophy, right? The Platonic ideal of tree. So we might all know what we mean when we say tree. But in fact, we're not thinking of the same tree, quite probably.
Yeah, and this actually just happened to me and Amanda. We were driving the other day looking at trees because it's the time of year where they're very nice to look at in our part of the world. And there's these plants, and it's hard. They're kind of between a tree and a bush, and I don't know what they are, but they turn a bright red color. And that right there kind of demonstrates your issue, right? Well, I don't know if the word tree or bush applies, so I'm not really sure what symbol to use to represent this thing. But the point is that in trying to communicate, hey, I like the way this thing looks to my wife, I'm trying to convey abstract information through a particular sort of cipher.
Yes.
And
yes.
And it's a completely imprecise thing.
I had a conversation with my daughter a few days ago because we were talking about the stars and constellations, and I know very little. I've informal amateur astronomy, but there's Saturn, there's Jupiter, here's Cassiopeia, and her point to me was, over the years when she was young and everything, I was trying to stoke that interest, and she said, I love the stars. She said, I'm paraphrasing, but I love looking up. It's stars. It's beautiful. I don't need to have a pattern for them in order to appreciate their beauty. But for those of us who did those handholds of on the wall climbing kind of thing of, but I need to have a name in order to somehow. It's almost territorial. It's almost imperialistic. I will name it, and thus it's under control.
Right.
When it's really not.
Yeah. And I think that a similar thing happens with everybody. I mean, you could say the same thing about the ocean. Somebody say, I like looking at the ocean. Well, why do they all like looking at the ocean? Some people might like the color. Some people might like the shapes of the waves. Some people might like the fish that they can see underneath the water. So there's an entirely different thought process. There's an abstract and conceptual chasm between these people, but the words that they use to express it are the same.
Think of the universal signs that we keep, that are appearing much more often across cultures now. For don't walk across, as a child walking across the road, or Amish buggies next 7 miles. I saw that going to Pike today, that little town, and we look at it and we interpret it. I don't know about you, but sometimes I've encountered the universal sign, and for a moment I'm not quite sure what it's representing. So I guess it's not quite so universal in the sense that I haven't encountered it enough. Right.
I remember seeing it was a funny meme that I saw the other day. It was a sign at a park, and on the sign there was various objects. So there was a dog and a skateboard and a cigarette and a alcoholic beverage, all in the normal kind of cartoonish drawing with a red X through them.
Yeah.
And but the way that the sign was written, it looked like the dog was riding the skateboard, smoking the cigarette, and drinking the beer. And the sign said, I don't know who this dog is, but he looks like a lot of fun, So there you had a symbol. What it was trying to say is, hey, none of these things are allowed here.
Yes.
But because of the way it was written, you can look at the sign and say, oh, hey, no really cool dogs that have a lot of bad habits.
I love it. I'm going to look that one up. But that is absolutely indicative of this marvelously interesting process of trying to pin things down simply, visually, and really just opening it up to which I think is wonderful. We always do. You and I go on about this all the time. Let's open it up. Let's question. Was that dog really intended?
Yeah. And so far, we've talked about a lot of language. The question I asked was, is any type of communication symbolism?
Wow.
And that adds a whole different layer because like you said, when you started, you said, okay, I responded with yes. Now we can assume that I'm just taking your answer on linguistic value. Okay, yes. So he's agreeing with the assessment that I made. But then you add body language or timing or all these other layers onto it. If you're rubbing your eyes, yes, then I know, he's agreeing with me, but it's ominous. There's something wrong with this agreement. It's a foreboding almost, Well, and that's just one example. You could add any number of
Let's approach it from the opposite. Can you think of anything that doesn't involve?
So communication that doesn't involve symbolism.
Or signs?
Or signs. It's hard. It's almost... I was about to... No, I don't think so. Because, I was... The one I was trying to boil it down to is maybe Morse code.
Oh, but
if on paper,
it's code.
Yeah, exactly. You're using it to, there's no real...
because there are agreed upon meanings for...
Yeah, exactly.
But did you learn Morse code when you were in the military? I wondered if they taught that or not. Okay. But yeah, that's code.
Right, yeah,
You've answered it.
So I can't... No,
the genetic
anything.
code. We're learning to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and we've assigned letters and alphanumeric meanings. I don't think so. Yeah,
there's no T's or A's in your DNA. These are just symbols to represent specific things.
Yeah.
So all right. So all type of communication is symbolism. So you can probably guess where I'm going to go with that for our next formative question, which is symbolism unique to humans? And I think the important part to take into account here when thinking about it is, I guess we'll have to bring the semiotics into it and say, all right, well, let's look at signs and symbols separately. Because if we just say symbols as one category, it's probably pretty clear animals use them.
Yeah.
So signs and symbols, if we separate the two, animals use signs. We're pretty sure of that. Do they use symbols?
Do they? Well, some kinds of animals. We're so new at this. We haven't done much with this yet, even though extraordinary people have been investigating bonobos, apes, chimps, but dolphins, whales. We still don't have a complete clue. But the scientists who work hardest on this suggest that the sounds that whales make seem to have meaning. So if those sounds are signs, they only mean essentially one thing. That's really if you really want to pin it down, a sign has a very located anchoring meaning. A symbol has anchored meanings. I think I just want to keep running with that. So they have signs, but yet some apes, using that broadly, can be taught to recognize a symbol and probably are using it as a sign, associating it with one thing, but we don't know. How do we know? Because we don't have the communication.
Yeah, there was a really famous case, and I can't remember the ape's name. I want to say it might have been Coco.
It's Coco. There was also Washoe. But
so, it was taught to use sign language, had a special keyboard that it could type on with symbols, Yeah. But there was really great debate about whether it was actually, using that abstract knowledge or whether it was conditioned response. Yeah. And that's that dividing line between signage and symbolism. Is he using these cues to achieve one thing, whether it's food or water or companionship? Or is he understanding what that sign means and the interpretive value between it to communicate with
Here we go,
somebody.
out of the bay into the deep ocean. Because
Right.
So
I'm going to suggest that there might be another layer to it, right? So you have signs and symbols, and we've delineated those categories. All right, a sign has a pretty objective, straightforward value. Symbols are more interpretive. Natural elements or elements originating from the cognition of the animal probably add a different layer to it. The example I'll use is I was just reading about whales, and what some whales will do, and this is common in birds too, is they have their own calls. So that's the way they communicate. And some whales, if they hear calls from a different whale, and they think that in mating. So, okay, this whale's sending out a mating call. He's not having much luck. He hears another whale that's making a mating call, and he thinks, that sounds more enticing. He'll copy that whale's call to try to draw in other females. Birds, similar, right? Birds have their own songs, but there's birds out there that will mimic other birds'
like
calls.
Catbirds.
Yeah, to accomplish a different mean. Yeah. And even cats themselves. Cats meow not to communicate with other cats. Cats meow to communicate with people, and they think that they're trying to mimic the cry of a baby because they understand that babies get attention if they cry. Do you think any of those three examples are symbolism, or do you think it's sort of an advanced use of signs in communication?
I think it's an advanced use of signs. As a layperson, just hearing that question for the first time, I think it's more that, although I can't help because it's you and me just poking. How do you know that's what the cat thinks? I keep going back to my dog of many years. She's been gone for 6 years now. I love that dog. Strider was her name. And my wife and I would always, she's standing at the door and looking back and forth with sand eyes. Well, Strider says she wants to go out. She said no such thing. I just put that word balloon in her. She might be wanting to go out, but I don't know what the reason necessarily is. I might be reading body language and say, okay, probably this. I don't know for sure. So I would say for science, yes, there's certainly advantageous use of signage.
Yeah, my parents were talking about this the other day. You know, there was an issue in National Geographic a couple of years ago with a border collie on the front, and the article talked about how the border collies could understand different words.
Yes.
And the experiments that they devised to figure that out.
Yep.
My parents have a border collie, and they were talking about how smart she is, and saying, you know, the thing that's fascinating about it is, like, even if you take the inflection out of your voice, Bisbee knows what you're saying. So if Bisbee's clawing at the door because she wants to go out, if you say, hold on a minute, she'll just sit there and wait until you let her out. Or if you say to Bisbee, go find Soren, she'll run and find my nephew.
Yeah.
So, you know, and even things like, and this one was actually one of the experiments they did in the National Geographic study, and my parents have replicated it. Bisbee has several of the same toys that are different colors. And so she'll bring a toy to my dad to throw, and he'll say, no, not the green one, the purple one. Yeah. And she'll drop it and go and find the purple one.
Right.
And that's actually kind of how they figured that dogs aren't completely colorblind. They do see some colors that they can do this. So now again, is it signs versus symbols? Well, we're running into the limits of language and the importance of symbols and even talking about it, right?
Yes,
because
we are.
Here we are with two concepts, and trying to find the distinction between them is more challenging than you'd think, which is why at the beginning of the show, I said, we're talking about symbols like we know what they are.
Yes.
You know? And so here we are trying to define them, and we're finding ourselves running up against some
yes,
issues.
We do. And when I said we're sailing out of the bay into the ocean, you said something, I can't quote you exactly a few moments ago, but you said something indicating that with a sign, everybody knows what it means, but and then we're talking about behavioral training. Well, we are behaviorally trained into taking symbols down a notch into signs as if we know exactly what they stand for. And this is where we get in all that problematic stuff with highly charged symbols when they mean other things to people than you want them to mean.
Right.
Not you personally, but then you, the generic. And so and then people start getting upset if people aren't interpreting their symbols the way they want them to.
Yeah, there's a human tendency to simplify things in order to understand. And yeah, that leads to a lot of issues when it comes to simplifying communication, communicative devices. And especially when those communicative devices can mean more than one thing. Like you said, if you're in an Old West, walking through an Old West town, you see a sign that's just a pair of eyeglasses. There's not a whole lot.
I need a pair of specs. I'm going to go in.
I mean, I guess you could say, oh, this is where I go to get glasses, or this is where I go to watch a movie, or you could assign different meanings to a pair of glasses on a sign. But some of them seem more obvious than others. Some of them...
what do you put on the sign for food? What would the universal sign for food be? Would you put a piece of cake? Would you put an apple?
Yeah, what food crosses culture? That ends up being the question, right? What food do people eat across cultures? And so I guess your best bet would be to study what natural food grows in the widest variety of climates and is consumed by the most people. You probably but then you're looking at, well, does that translate visually? Can you put grain on a sign and have people think that it means food? Probably not.
We are right now. We are in the zone when I was teaching technical communication, technical writing. This is one of the most fascinating parts of it that people don't ordinarily think they're going to get into. Technical writing, well, business writing. I've got to be clear. I've got to establish clarity. Yes, but clarity of symbols too. And how much of a symbol do you pair with, or a sign do you pair with your text, and how do you keep them separate, and what represents what, and then across cultures, and it's incredibly complicated. People wanted to. Well, everybody should just learn English. Yeah, and so what? Because even if everybody learns English, which isn't necessarily the best language to learn as a universal language, it's still not cut and dried what everything means. This is where it gets watered down when people think, well, we're clear. We know what this means. Well, maybe, but not everywhere in the United States. And certainly not everywhere in the rest of the world. So signs can become... Symbols can become diminished into signs, and that they can be further diminished into absolute knowledge. And
and one example is, it's been looked at, and they've found that we've lost just a huge percentage of words in the English language since the 1950s because they're falling out of use. And some people like to look at that and say, well, the English language is becoming more efficient, and so, but, if you're looking at it symbolically, it's pretty easy to debunk that argument because you think about efficiency and you think, okay, well, let's just look at colors then, right? What if you had one word for blue and green and then you saw aquamarine? Well, how would you describe that? Well, is it blue or is it green? Well, the word aquamarine doesn't exist, so you're either stuck with saying it's blue or it's green. How are you going to...
Exactly. It's our teacher, old friend, and we have this discussion sometimes about various oil paint colors. And they're delicious to say. And they also indicate all kinds of values, visual values. But yeah, it's Orwellian. One of the things in 1984 that I found most frightening as an English teacher and as a student of writing is when one of the main the occupation for the Winston Smith is that he's diminishing the dictionary, paring down all those unnecessary words. One of the best ways to diminish a culture into ignorance is to remove words, and we're doing it at a wild rate. So fewer words, so we can just all understand what we mean. No. Fewer words so you can be less certain about what you're saying, so maybe you'll say less, and so you'll just roll over and let whatever powers that be govern you. It's dangerous.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've had this experience, if I have, and I've had it quite often, where I'll say something to somebody and then there will be a word that's 3 syllables or more in there.
Mhm.
And so they'll say, what does that mean? And so I try to describe it and they say, well, why didn't you just say that then?
Yeah.
I said, well, because that's the equivalent of saying blue, green. You know, it's not aquamarine. You're saying blue, green. Just because you described this word using other words doesn't mean you captured the meaning of the word.
Well, this is, see, now we have moved marvelously into language as collections of signs and symbols, right? And of course, I've been in that situation more times than I can count, with students who are saying, why don't these writers just come right out and say what they mean? And I'm in the position of saying they do. They are stylistically, with subtlety and with care, trying to take you to an experience that can be shared. And the delicious nature of language itself is they are choosing just the right words to do that. But if you don't know those words, or you think you don't have access to them, which of course you do, which anybody can go to the dictionary and anybody can read the dictionary. Probably not cover to cover. Most of us don't do that, but it's one of the most fascinating, wonderful experiences you can do is go to a dictionary, open up, look at 5 new words for that day. And maybe you'll use one, and maybe you'll try. And people say, why are you using that word? Well, because I like the sound of it. It'll become normalized after a while because you'll hear me saying it over and over. Symbols become normalized. Signs more so because they have that individual meaning that we think that they're supposed to have.
So let's ask another formative question, which is, are symbols purely cultural? And I think this kind of goes back to our looking at infinity, right? So infinity that's a global symbol for something that is unending. Maybe not completely global. There's people that would see it and wouldn't understand. But
could be. Here's what we mean with the symbol. See, that's what that's a sign. But then you start to say, well, all the different things that I associate with infinity. But so you're asking it a different way.
So let's see. So the question is, are symbols purely cultural? I think where that becomes an issue is defining cultural in the modern world, because we're a globalized species now. So we have pockets of culture, I guess, right? Our little town has its own pocket of culture, for good or bad. Yeah. The state as a whole has a culture. Yeah. The country has a culture. And then perhaps even the world, the parts of the world that use the infinity symbol have some kind of unifying culture.
But they all started as, every symbol, I would argue, began with a cultural anchor. You said the swastika at the beginning. Take Ouroboros, the worm eating itself. Now, I just said that, and there'll be some people listening to us who may be familiar with that, and some who may not. What? Ouroboros. Okay, well, all right. So it's a sign of a snake or a serpent-like creature eating its own tail. Now, that stands for many things. It's often used as a metaphor. Its symbols are indicative of metaphors. But it emerged from a very specific cultural context which would that we are aware of, at least, which would be the Greek context. Which is not to say that it didn't exist as a symbol in other places, too, but we may not have been aware of that. But we encountered it first through those roots.
Right. So symbols have cultural anchors. When these symbols are devised, they had a meaning to the people that devised them. Now, that meaning can be diffused or reinterpreted by other cultures as it spreads. And again, a swastika is a good example of that. Because if you think about it, like I said in the intro, the first examples we can find are 12,000 years old. Yeah. That's almost as old as culture itself, as far as humans are concerned. So it's an ancient thing. and it's been found in various places. The first one, 12,000 years ago, was found in Ukraine, and then there was found in Uganda, and obviously it's a huge thing in India and in China. So it's a global phenomenon. But it happened so long ago that it's almost hard for us to even know what it originally came from. Because you think about that shape, and a lot of people like to provide like a Christian interpretation of it. But this far predates
Christianity.
that. There's a cross with the bent arms.
Yeah.
And, and then it's funny thinking about it, because now you're thinking in a purely abstract, conceptual way. When you see that symbol, what does it make you think, or how does it make you feel? Kind of like when you're talking about the word tree. Why does that combination of letters seem to give us the information relating to the world as it does?
And it's behaviorally trained. It's politically, sociologically, historiographically contextualized to that moment, perhaps. But think of signs for the zodiac. It's fun. I mean, people, look. If you look at how many different versions there are of something like Pisces, the fish, with usually like 2 or 3 ripply shaped water patterns and a fish, but the water patterns in the fish are remarkably diverse. And yet we look at it and say, Pisces. Or I think that's Pisces. Well, then we've been trained to associate that, or we learn to associate that with that. But then it becomes a symbol, because Pisces represents all kinds of things. And they don't all just do an equal sign and there it is. It's just those things sometimes cross into other signs. Okay, so that's the zodiac. But you take signs in ancient Norse. This represents Balder. This represents Thor. Okay, you look at it and you say, I didn't think of Thor when I saw that. You go to a Renaissance festival or something, and but you look the sign up and you say, okay, because this is a sign for knowledge. Oh, well, I wouldn't have thought knowledge with that either. So the artificiality of it when you encounter a new symbol is really fun, because, that's not what I thought it was. Okay, I'll think of it that way, but why would it represent that? And then you're creatively engaging with the symbol.
Yeah, and so I think what makes symbols fascinating is that there's the cultural anchor, which is a premeditated cognitive application. But I think that natural elements slip into symbolism in ways that you might not really think about at first. And I think you have to ask some pretty deep questions to get there. Like, okay, why is a stop sign red? They could have made it any color and wrote stop on it. And because we have the ability to communicate linguistically, we would know to stop. But they paint them red.
Because the color red is symbolically associated with danger, and,
right,
and high attention, and
So, but
somebody said that in the first place, right?
But that red color isn't culturally agreed upon. That's something that red is it's a primal, or it's built into the human psyche.
Now we're getting into the unconscious, the Jungian kind of stuff.
So then that question, would lead to, so do you think when they created stop signs, do you think that they understood that when they made it the color red? Or do you think that they just made it the color red because they were subconsciously influenced by the thought of danger or attention?
I think probably the first, that it was red associates with this. I think it's with signs, you're trying to find that which is most universal. You're not necessarily digging into where it came from. I don't think it goes that
Probably on something as widespread as stop signs. I think you're right, but I think that there might be other symbols where natural elements so subconsciously leak into it, right? So now we're transferring from our formative into the speculative, right? So, in talking about the zodiac, that brings us close to that, what you just mentioned, which is psychoanalytic symbolism. Do you think that there's a value to psychoanalytic symbolism?
I absolutely think there's a value to it, if nothing else, than the conversational value, the causing one again to ask questions, as always, and to probe and to wonder. And so, yeah, that's that. If nothing else, that would be worthy.
All right, you're forcing my hand, so I'm gonna pose it a different way. What value does psychoanalytic symbolism provide that the zodiac doesn't?
Ooh. Okay, forced your hand, and I think I'm going to fold. What value does psychoanalytic symbolism have that the zodiac? Well, arguably the zodiac arises out of psychoanalytic criticism before it was ever called psychoanalytic criticism. And we want to know. We go back to other things about epistemology. We want to know. We've talked in different podcasts about wanting to be certain.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you create a sign, you are asserting a certainty that may well disappear, but you're asserting it. And when you create a symbol, that's also sometimes an assertion of certainty past the safe space of the sign.
Yeah, so this is an important question, and this really demonstrates why talking about symbolism is important, right? Because there's large swaths of psychology, sociology, these kinds of fields that still teach psychoanalytic things, and they don't rely on them like they did in the past. There's definitely
it's far beyond its roots.
Right. There's definitely an attitude of this is an antiquated sort of thing, but it's still taught. There's still aspects of it that are used.
Yeah.
Whereas under absolutely no circumstances would the zodiac be read about in a psychology textbook, right? Other than maybe what effects it has on somebody's psychology.
Yeah, right. I mean, no, it's not going to be considered the sound knowledge. No. Let's take something really safe before we get to the... So this is not endorsing a product, but I think it's recognizable. Drive into a mobile station. What's the sign for mobile gas?
Well, we've had a couple over the years, but they had the Pegasus in the past.
And it's still there. If you look at most tanks or most distribution places, it's there. Now, what's Pegasus?
Well, it's a fictional mythological creature. It's a horse with wings.
Yes. Sign or symbol? Well, and what element is it a sign, and what element does it move into a symbol? Because there's both.
That's a tough question.
I want you to mull it, and then there's another one. Again, gasoline, because we're such a gasoline-focused culture. Certainly we're only, look what we've done to the planet in 110 years. Because of gasoline, primarily. There was, just in the 60s, but it was really established a higher point advertising wise in the 60s. There's a star, red star. You can trust your car to the man who wears the star. The big red Texaco star. That was the jingle. So you'd see a red star. Aha! Texaco station. Even if I didn't see the Texaco, I know that that's a place where I can go get gasoline and service. In the 50s, 60s. Okay. Red stars can mean many things.
Yeah.
And if you look at, Soviet. And anyway, so Pegasus, flying horse. What the heck?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's nice. They just slapped it on there, right? No.
People in marketing don't just slap stuff on.
Why would we associate gasoline with a flying horse?
I guess that the assumption might be that it's going to provide your car with some sort of benefit,
Speed.
Right.
Flight.
Yeah.
Go fast, man. Okay, fine. But Pegasus was a lot more than that. Pegasus was a really fascinating character in mythology. And again, many people don't go that far. with mythology. But if you look at it and say, oh, okay, there's a lot of associations here. It's a sign for Mobil gas, now ExxonMobil, right? But it's a symbol that carries all kinds of latent power that the advertisers, I'm sure, were probing and still do, but that folks who don't necessarily go there, they haven't thought about that. Nike. Some Nike, right? The sneakers goddess of speed. Well, there's a lot of other aspects associated with that goddess that are worth probing into. So symbols can be reduced into signs and made safe until one starts to think about it.
So bringing that back to psychoanalysis, do you think psychoanalysis is just derived from that human need to try to simplify things to make them easier to understand, like we spoke about earlier?
No, because to be fair, I think psychoanalytic work is a very deep and complicated science applied. I think that it comes from wanting to understand, wanting to help heal and balance.
Okay.
But yeah, so I don't, but no, I don't think it is.
Okay. And I would agree with you, but it's important that we talk about it because we are trying to,
well, of course
we're trying to get to the bottom of it, find the answers, right? And I think that the primary difference between the zodiac and psychoanalysis is that the zodiac is ascribing you characteristics based off of a time frame when you were born, whereas psychoanalysis is more looking at you. One's deductive and one's inductive, right? You're starting with something and then ascribing attributes to it, whereas in the other, you're doing the opposite. You're looking at the attributes and then you're trying to assign something, an origin or a reason for it.
Yep.
So there's a methodological difference, and one's definitely more based on science, and it, sure, maybe it does. Boil down to simplifying things to make them easier to understand. But that's essentially how all human knowledge is derived. We have 3 pounds of brain matter. We can't possibly expect ourselves to understand the universe and its entire complexity. So we try to make things simple enough for us to at least grasp at generalities about them.
Yeah, but build enough of a ladder so we can start to reach up and hope that somebody else is going to put the next rung there.
Right. Yeah.
I am so chomping on the bit to get to it. I'm waiting for it, Joel.
So, do you think that we can create meaning without symbolism?
No, I don't. And I'm not just saying that in a flip way, because that's just when you've gone through the academic life, your initial training and so on, all the way through, you come to realize, and you don't have to take the academic approach to come to realize this, that without those symbols, again, there's not the communication. So I don't think there's a way in.
So, all right, and let's relate that back to our talk about animals, right? Mm-hmm. So we're thinking that maybe animals don't have symbolism. Maybe they're just able to use signage in unique ways. So if that has an effect on meaning, creation of meaning, mm-hmm. then it has a also an indelible effect on consciousness, you think, right?
Yes.
So symbolism is necessary. Identifying symbols could be used as a metric for identifying consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Even identifying signs, because you have to be conscious in order to use signs.
Right. And so now, so symbolism, a hallmark of consciousness, mm-hmm. but symbolism in itself is subjective, abstract, and conceptual. Mm-hmm. What does that say about reality?
Those same 3 adjectives. It's conceptual, it's abstract. What was the third one?
Yeah.
Well, because reality is itself an abstract word that we like to try to make safe and render a single meaning to it. See, I love this because it's pulling us back to all kinds of other strands of conversations. We know, we've talked about this before too, if our eyes were able to pick up more than just a small spectrum or our ears or the electromagnetic radiation, I wouldn't be looking at your studio and seeing what I'm seeing. I would be seeing colors and bands and waves, and that would be that reality. So the reality is only is dependent upon our ability to take in through our very limited senses.
Right. Yeah, and an interesting article I was just reading recently was that the color yellow itself is a symbol for humans, because humans do not possess the physical structures in our eye to perceive the color yellow. So anytime you see yellow, it's your brain essentially saying, okay, well, there's a gap between this wavelength and this wavelength. We're just going to guess this is what it looks like. So, and
then Crayola comes along and makes the color with 15 different names.
Right. So yellow is just a symbol. There's no, it's not directly relating to something else. So I guess, and I'm going to tie that in with another study that I just read recently, and who knows how they arrived at this number, but essentially some physicists are saying there's a 50-50 chance we live in a simulation versus the real world, right?
Yeah, that's become, since the early 90s, that's become a very strong strand. I've seen some that say 25%, some that say 30%, but some are much more, yeah.
So I guess the question then would be, how do we... So we know we've established reality is more fluid than concrete just now, but how do we know something actually exists as opposed to nothing? You know?
How in the world did we get all the way here?
Can we use symbols to try to determine that? Or do you think that the very nature of symbols is what creates that uncertainty?
That. As my granddaughter would say. Symbols are a way of expressing associations, abstract concepts. So we use symbols to represent. I don't think symbols themselves are the basis of the knowledge.
Oh, that's real interesting. Because we need symbols to create meaning, right? We talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
So, I'm trying to figure out.
You're doing a chicken and egg thing, aren't you?
Yeah. Are we getting into a circular sort of reasoning, or are we ending up with some logical?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to take something. If you say no, we can't go there, then I'll just stop.
Okay.
All right. But it's timely. It's something that everybody talks about. If I say the word flag, I just know that people are hopping to something very specific in their minds. It's a word, right? And if I say a definite article before it and say the flag, what does your head go to?
The American flag.
Right. Okay. Because we're Americans. If you say the flag and you're British, then I can't guarantee that though. But well, the word the is a definite article, means the one. So that means that all other flags are less than that one. Which means that you prioritize your culture over all others, which also means you only prioritize the people in your culture who assume that same thing about the flag. And if people say a flag, then you've got people saying, go live somewhere else because you don't love the country. All of that political, I just started, all of that is bound up in that one word. Assumptions, assertions, demands, and it's just a word.
Yeah, so extrapolating that out to our bigger conversation, right? We have symbols that are culturally based. So if we're looking at humans sharing cultural phenomena based around sensory information, then we're ascribing more weight to our reality than to realities that can be perceived outside of our perceptual experience.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't invalidate that sort of data, which is where we get into some really strange physics and some really strange issues about what experts are telling us about reality, you know, and that creates problems with people who lack certain amounts of scientific literacy. And the same way that it creates problems when you put the word "the" in front of a flag or any other number of describing words in front of whatever flag you may be talking about. And creates all kind of issues. And I don't want to get I don't want to get into it at this point because we're going to do probably a whole nother episode on it. Plus, we're at the end of our time here, but yeah, oh man, that was a really good conversation. So I'm looking forward to the next one. Until next time, keep pondering.